Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, we're looking at some basic graphing skills that you must have. Graphs are very, very important for trying to understand relationships between things. So why are we going to look at this? This is not the end goal, just being able to graph things. We use graphs, especially in physics, but also all kinds of other disciplines use graphs as well. Not just making graphs, but using the graph to understand something further and look in more depth and get more meaning out of it. So in some detail, why study graphs? Why understand this stuff? You can show what's called qualitative or quantitative information. So these two words in quotes might remind you of some other words. Qualitative, like the word quality, or just the general nature of things. A graph can answer the question in a qualitative way, like, is there a relationship between two things? If there is the relationship an increasing relationship, a decreasing relationship? Those are qualitative types of understanding. Quantitative is when you actually have numbers, you have data. You are plotting points on a graph. You have numerical scales, as you see in this example here, and we'll get to this in a minute. And that's probably the one you're more used to, the quantitative type of graph. Also, visual representation is often easier to understand. The whole thing, a picture is worth 1,000 words. A graph really is a picture of the information. The visual can give you a real quick insight into what might be happening, beyond just the numbers, without having to rely on the numbers themselves. Also, a graph allows you to show something or how something is affected when you change something else. In performing an experiment, what you'll do is you'll have something that you change. For example, you change the slope on a ramp as you roll an object down the ramp, and that change in the slope of the ramp might affect the acceleration of that object going down the ramp, and you can compare those two things. So it helps with experimentation and analyzing the data from the experiment. So there's when you graph, you're really comparing two sets of numbers called the variables. There's one called the independent variable, and that's one you change in an experiment. You control it. For example, rolling an object down the ramp, you control the angle of the ramp. There's the other called the dependent variable, and that's the variable that you watch. You are paying attention to it to see how it responds. When you create a graph, you are traditionally putting the independent variable on the horizontal axis and the dependent variable on the vertical axis. When you are doing something, particularly with a quantitative type of graph like this one, the data ranges that you have will help you determine the scales. The scale is the numbers on each axis, and the numbers start at a certain place and end at a certain place, and the data range that you have helps you determine that. You definitely need to label each axis, particularly with the name and units of measure on a quantitative graph especially. For example, here you can see that we have labeled the spring length, and the unit would be centimeters. You need to plot carefully when doing quantitative graphing. Where the points go on the graph matters, because if you do it in a sloppy fashion, you might not see the pattern that you are supposed to see, or the pattern that actually exists there in real life, because the graph might be made in too sloppy a manner. You're also going to ask yourself a question. This is a very common question. Is the relationship linear or nonlinear? And we're going to see mostly linear relationships, but we will look at a number of nonlinear situations as well. You'll see that coming. And that basically means, do you see a graph that is straight or curvy, if that helps you understand that. So let's look at an example now. In this example, we're attaching a spring to a surface, and we're going to hang different masses on the end of the spring. We're going to see how much the spring stretches. And so we record some data organized here in this data table: the mass on the spring measured in grams, and the spring length measured in centimeters. And we start with no mass on the spring, and we see the spring length starts at 13.7 centimeters. And just adding 10 grams, then 20 grams, and 30 grams, we can see how the length of the spring changes. And it may not be easy to look at just the numbers here and see any kind of particular pattern. Although you can see, well, as these numbers increase, it seems that these also increase. That would be a type of qualitative relationship that you can see even before you make a graph. can see that it's an increasing relationship. But now you go to graph it. So we set up the independent variable on the horizontal axis and the dependent variable on the vertical axis. Another way to remember the difference between dependent and independent is that one of these depends on the other. So the spring length, the length of that spring, does depend on how much mass we have hanging from it. If you set it the other way, you would quickly realize that you would have it wrong. Does the mass on the end of the spring depend on how long the spring is? Well, no, that's a little silly. So that's not how it works. And so now we have to set up the scales, the numbers on each axis. And the data range for the mass goes from 0 to 30. So we set up numbers from 0 to 30, and we have to space those out consistently and evenly. And then the same thing for the length of the spring. It starts at 13.7 and it ends at 16.0. So we want to make sure that we set up a scale that encompasses all of this data, that allows us to show all of this data. We don't have to start exactly at 13.7. We can start at 13. We have a little bit of unused space on the graph, and that's totally fine, not a problem. But we clearly go from 13 up to 16 in a nice, even manner. We're not using the actual data to create these marks on the scale. That would not be right. That's a little pitfall, a little mistake that sometimes students make. Don't use these actual numbers, but look at the range of numbers that we have. It starts where and ends where, and that tells you that our scale here has to start and end to encompass all of these numbers here. And then you plot the points very carefully. 0, 13.7, so I have to go to 0 and go up to estimate 13.7 there. At 10, I've got 14.5, so 10, 14.5. At 20, I've got 15.3. 20 grams, I've got 15.3, estimating that right there. And at 30 grams, I've got 16.0 centimeters. 30 grams, 16.0 centimeters. Okay, and then I did a line of best fit, and that's not mentioned here, but you see this line of best fit. And you notice that the line doesn't touch all of the data points. And it clearly misses that one, and it sort of misses that one. That's totally normal. You will almost never want to go dot to dot. Don't just connect the dots, please. You want a trend line, a line of best fit, a line that best represents the data. And in this case, especially, watch this. It's not so hard to see it, but if I do this with the paper, and you can kind of see, look, those dots line up very well. They look very linear. So I drew a line of best fit to show, let's look at the paper now, to show that linear relationship, and it best represents the data even though it doesn't touch every data point. And that's it. So that's the basics of graphing. Thank you for watching. I will catch you next time.